Okay, so welcome to this session on BMC IMS Managed ACBs. And this is the first session in a series of webinar. We will have a total of 6 sessions. Then this is going to be the first one, followed by a few more, which I am going to talk about in detail. So myself, Anshul Agrawal, I am a manager, product development, working on BMC AMI data for IMS, particularly on backup and recovery and fast path products. And with me today, I have Subhashish, who is a co-host with me, and he's a product manager for BMC AMI data for IMS products. Okay, just for saving some bandwidth, I will turn off my camera. Okay, Subhashish, you can still see my first slide, right?
Yes, I can. And I believe everybody can. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So myself, Anshul Agrawal, I have total of around 15 years of experience working in mainframe. I started with the application programming, particularly on COBOL and assembler. And since last 8 years, I have been working in BMC. Started as a developer, and then recently, in last 10 months, I have took over the additional responsibilities of people management as well. Okay, so talking about the series as an agenda. So as I mentioned, this is just the first session of the whole series that we are going to conduct, right? And in total there will be 6 sessions, and we are going to deep dive into each and every one of the sessions going forward. So today is the first session where we will just talk about the overview of BMC ME data for IMS products from the perspective of IMS catalog and IMS managed ACB readiness. We all know that there is a mandate coming up from IBM that by summers of 2025 managed ACB is going to be mandatory, right? So obviously, if you are using BMC utilities and BMC IMS tools, you would be concerned whether our tools already support managed DCB and IMS catalog, and what is our roadmap and planning for the next, 1 year. So today we are going to just talk about a little bit of background about catalog and managed DCBs. I know you might have heard about this from Deepak Kohli and IBM experts several times, but it will be just to have some kind of background before we start this series, because I expect there will be some people who might not have much familiarity with that. So today we will deep dive into that. And then going forward in the second session, we will talk about the full function utilities and how they support IMS managed ACBs, and what are the different options and keywords, and we'll have some demo as well. And similarly for our backup and recovery tools, we will showcase how they support managed ACBs, and especially our archive image copy utility, how it supports managed DCB. So the second session will be geared toward that, and we will be sending a separate registration link for the second session and the rest of the session, so you can always pick and choose the topic of your interest and attend these following sessions. Third session will particularly be about fast path utilities, how it supports fast managed DCB and catalog is supported in fast path utilities, and if you are using second indexes, how those things will be handled. So that will be the third session. And the fourth session will be on our transaction manager products, particularly Delta, and then some of the other products like application restart control, batch optimizer, and our cope products. So those things will be covered on the fourth session. You can also look at the date and time. Time is going to be the same. It will be Wednesday, 7 to 8 Indian Standard Time. But these are the dates, like today is the 17th July. So we have the first session. Second session is on 24th. And then we have a couple of weeks gap in the sessions, and you can look at these dates. And the fifth session will be more geared towards some of the exploration that you can use from using BMC image change manager for IMS, catalog manager for IMS, and database advisor. So those are tools which can help you handle your catalog and manage the CB environment better. And we have DBA toolkit and database integrity products as well. And then the last session will be more of a follow up session. If you have anything outstanding which were pending from these first 5 sessions, which needs additional assistance on answers. So we will be doing that, and that will be a panel of members who will address those questions in that sixth session. So we are expecting this entire series to end by mid of September, and so that our customers will be comfortable in knowing that how BMC utilities are already supporting managed ACB and what they need to do or not need to do, to order to convert to IMS managed ACB. So that's the whole agenda. And today we will, talk about the first one, which is the overview and how our utilities in general support IMS managed ACBs and IMS catalog. So this is going to be the agenda of the call today. I will give you a little history and the background. As I mentioned, you might have heard this from Deepak Kohli and some other IBM IMS experts, but still, I will give you some history. Then we'll talk about the introduction to IMS catalog and introduction to IMS directory, how the world will look like after everything will be converted to IMS managed DCB if we compare it with the world, how it looks today. And then while you will transition to DDL, because that's the eventual goal of using IMS catalog and IMS managed DCB to be able to run the DDL, how that path will be when you transition to DDL, convert everything to only use DDL, and how your life will look like post TDL transition is complete, because at one day that will be the only option to implement changes. All your DBDJ and PSB change, those things will go away. And then we'll talk about the BMC IMS utilities, how they detect and enable IMS catalog and manage DCB support. And last but not the least, I am pretty sure if you are an existing BMC AMI data for IMS customer, you would be interested in knowing if you are using those products, whether they already support IMS catalog and manage DCB or not. So there will be a link and a QR code which you can scan, and that will directly point you to a TB, which talks about our current support of IMS managed DCB, and if there are anything outstanding, what's the plan for that in next few months. That would be very handy for you. Okay, so let me give you some history and background of why we are talking about this. I know if you are related to IMS in some way or other, you might be hearing about IMS managed ACB, and you are impacted by IMS managed ACB.
Hey,
But
Anshul,
why? Yeah,
sorry to interrupt you. I we have a question from Albert, I guess. He has raised his hand, so I'll just unmute Albert.
yeah,
Yeah. Hey, Albert, please see if you can talk now.
yeah. Albert has to unmute himself first.
Hey, Albert, you have to unmute yourself to speak. Or
Subhashis,
if
we
you,
can take his question later.
yeah, we can take your question later, Albert, or maybe you can type in the question. We'll try to get to the question. Sorry, Anshul, thanks.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning to about the history of IMS catalog and managed DCB, why we are even talking about it today. So and why this all becomes a buzzword and a hot topic all of a sudden. So several years back, there was few architects in the IBM lab. They were sitting and discussing, because some customers raised the concern that they are experiencing problems in terms of managing their IMS systems and IMS databases. Slowly the IMS DB expertise is diminishing, and there is a concept of something called as universal DBA, and there will be one DBA who is supposed to do the work of both the DB to DB and IMS DBA. And there was an ask or a request from a wider community to simplify IMS, right? Especially in terms of how we access the data and how we manage the data in IMS. And that's the reason IMS catalog came into existence, and that's the reason IMS managed ACB has came into existence. But let's first talk about IMS catalog, right? So we know that in IMS database, we have to define the database using DBD source, and we have to define applications using PSB source. And DBD source is nothing but a set of assembler macros where we, define how the database should look like. And similarly, we have bunch of PHP macros which will define how a particular application will look at that particular database, right? So when you think of it, it would be better to take an example. Let's consider there is a bank database, okay, and it consists of three segments. So three segments are customer segment, payment segment, and the card segment. And if you are more familiar with the SQL or DB2 terminologies, you can call these as tables. So there is one table space or database which consists of three tables. One is the customer table, one is the card table, and one is the account payments table. Okay. So similarly, if you talk in the IMS terminology, there is a customer segment, there is a card segment, and there is a payment segment. And payment and card segment is the child of the customer segment. So when we define this structure in the DBD source using those assembler macros, what we basically do is if we are defining the customer segment, we might only define few important fields like customer ID, customer name, customer phone number, customer address, and that in total might only be of 150 bytes, right? But your customer segment record can be of 500 bytes, but we only define some important fields in the DBD source. So when you think about it, the rest of the information is lying mainly under application program. So if it's a COBOL program, it will be a COBOL copybook. If it's a PLI1, it will be PLI constructs. And if it's Java, those information might be in some kind of Java classes, right? So that information which is basically application specific information is spread across different platform. And you can imagine the complexity involved. If you have to make any changes, you have to involve different stakeholders, obviously database administrators, application programming team, and sysprocs at minimum. Uh, but with the introduction of catalog, those things can be simplified because all that metadata, which is stored in different places in different formats, are now moved into a central location, and that's called IMS catalog. So everything which was there in the DBD source is now moving into IMS catalog, and everything which was there in the application copybooks is now moving into IMS catalog, and that's a central repository. And if you are familiar with DB2, DB2 already support catalog. Although one catch with DB2 catalog is with every DB2 version upgrade, catalog needs to be upgraded, but that's not required with the IMS catalog. So that's one good thing. Okay. So as I was giving that example where several experts were discussing what is the good way to simplify some of these challenges related to managing this metadata, and obviously they thought of IMS catalog similar to DB2, and so they thought of IMS catalog, but how to implement that IMS catalog? And very interestingly, they chose to implement IMS catalog as IMS database itself, right? So we all know that IMS catalog is a one of the IMS database types, which is HellDB, implemented as phidem OSAM. And there are several different types of IMS databases available, right? And obvious question is how they arrived to this choice that HellDB with phidem and OSAM is the best choice for your IMS catalog, which will be storing the metadata, which is your data about your database definitions and application definitions and other things. So I asked this question to one of the IBM expert in one of the conferences why they have chosen HellDB. If you are talking about performance or speed, one natural choice could be FastPath, right? But one of the reasons they have not implemented IMS catalog as FastPath DDB is it does not support DLI batch. So that will take away the ability to update the database in a pure batch mode. So that was one reason. Another reason was not all the customers have fastpath databases and they might not have the utilities to maintain IMS catalog. Because when you think of it, since IMS catalog is implemented as IMS database, so you need to give all the care and attention, you know, you generally give to any general IMS database, and even more because that's housing all the critical information of your IMS database. So it's a trusted online source for IMS database and application metadata information, and it can be accessed via both standard JDBC SQL call from IMS 13 onwards, although IMS catalog was introduced in IMS 12 itself, and I think it's more than a decade now since IMS catalog first came into existence. But interestingly, you can also do a DLI or DL1 access calls, which are a special type of calls called GUR calls, GUR calls from the IMS catalog database, and it will return you the information in XML format. One thing to note here is there could be multiple versions of metadata that can be stored. Mainly because, let's say, if you are doing any change, in that case, you might populate your catalog with that specific change. Let's say I've talked about that example bank database, which has customer segment, card segment, and payment segment. And we want to add another segment, let's say account. In that case, we will make changes to the DBD source and we will do the DBD gen. We will do the ACB gen and we will populate the catalog. So catalog will create a new instance. It will be a new segment occurrence, right? Which will be stored in IMS catalog. But let's say you are not happy with that. In that case, you might tweak your DBD source again, and you will do the DBD gen again, ACB gen again, and you'll populate the IMS catalog. So that will create a new instance of the same metadata. So it will create a new segment occurrence, the IMS catalog database. And eventually it might be 5 iterations, right? Before you decide and finalize, okay, these are the changes I want to go ahead with. And in that case, the previous 4 occurrences are of not any use. And in that case, there is a utility called catalog purge utility, which with the help of which you can purge the older entries. So that's the meaning of multiple versions of metadata. There was another concept of something called as database versioning, but that's not really directly related to this. So this is what IMS catalog history and what IMS catalog is and why it came into existence. And to my knowledge, I think there are already some customers who are successfully using IMS catalog in the production environment without any issues or concerns. Okay, so I am talking about the metadata, right? Which is the data about your database, about your applications. We call it data about the data. And all this technical metadata is now getting stored in catalog, which is a HellDB database. So when you talk about from the database characteristics perspective, obviously all the things that goes into DBD and PHB source, your database structure definitions, your physical database definitions, your segment definitions, your field definitions. And from the application perspective, those information which was previously part of the application programs like data types, application defined fields, some redefines, user defined types, and some structures. Now, all those things are clubbed together and stored in a single place, which is called IMS catalog. Similarly, there was another concept, or there is another concept called as repository vSAM. So we know that, let's say, if you are defining any new database or application to IMS, you obviously need to define the DBD source and PHB source and do this gen process and populate the ACB lib. But obviously, one more thing you need to do is you need to define those databases and transactions and applications in the sysgen macro. And when you do the sysgen, those information gets populated in mod blocks, right? Which is what IMS use when it comes up to determine, okay, these are the active databases and these are the active applications. So IBM came up with something called as DRD few years back, and that was basically to replace mod blocks with some other constructs that will give you the ability to add or update resources on the fly. So as I mentioned, mod block resources, which contains your program definitions, transaction definition, then your format resources and your application specific input output message definitions. Those can be stored in vsam repository for IMS if you are using DRD implementation. It is also possible that you are using catalog in IMS managed ACB, but you are still using mod blocks for your program definition and transaction definitions. I'm pretty sure you might have seen this picture in the past. Uh, as I mentioned, catalog is implemented as HALDB, which is an IMS database itself. And we all know that IMS database is a hierarchical database. So there is a root segment and there are child segments and further child or dependent segments. So if you look at it on the left hand side, there is a DBD segment type, and on the right hand side, there is a PSB segment type. So if you look at DBD source, we have several assembler macros, and for each and every assembler macro, there is a special segment type in this catalog database. Similarly, for PSB, for each and every PSB assembler macro in the PSB source, there is an equivalent segment type on this hierarchy. But one important thing you might want to notice here is there is some color coding, right? Since this is implemented as PHIDAM OSAM, there is different dataset groups, right? So here it talks about four dataset groups: DHG, A, B, C, and D, and they are color coded. Dataset group A is white. Dataset groups B is gray, and C is green, and D is blue, right? Or sky blue. So the reason behind this color coding is those segments in this database which will be most accessed, right, or which are expected to be accessed very frequently, they are in dataset group A. And then those segment which are expected to be accessed second most, they are part of the dataset group B. And similarly, third most and fourth most are part of dataset group C and dataset group D. One more important thing to note here is, apart from this color coding, there is this segment, or you can call it a secondary index database, which is in yellow. And one of the primary thing it is housing is the cross linkage between the DBDs and PSBs. We know that a particular database might be associated with several different PSBs. So all that cross linking information is present in the second index database, which is highlighted in yellow. And I think what IBM recommend is to at least have two partitions, because one to store DVDs and one to store PSBs. But when you look at it closely, right, on the DBD side, you have this green color coding, right, for field, for marshals, and for properties. But on the PSB side, you don't have the green color coding. So in that case, those things will remain empty on the PSB side for those partitions. I'm sure some of this information was discussed in the past, but I am just setting the base and the context so that it will be useful for everyone who might not be aware about some of these things. So we talked about IMS catalog, right? Why it came into existence and what is the advantage of IMS catalog. So what is the next step after IMS catalog? Obviously, IMS managed ACBs. So when we say IMS managed ACBs, what exactly that mean? Because today ACBs are managed by user, DBAs, and other groups, right? But when we say IMS is going to manage the ACBs, which means we are transferring that responsibility to IMS itself, and IMS will take care of managing all the ACBs. ACBs are not going away. We are simply transferring the responsibility from user to IMS itself. IMS at its core is still process these control blocks in the ACB format. So this IMS managed ACB concept came into existence from IMS 14 and above, and users can optionally enable IMS managed ACB by making a use of one parameter in the catalog section of this member df stf xxx, and they can mention ACB management equals to catalog, and that way you can enable IMS managed ACB. And basically that is nothing but the extension of your ACBs which is stored in the catalog. So when you think of it at the core, I've talked about doing the DBD gen of that bank database, PSB gen for its application view, and then ACB gen, right? And we at some point or the other we might have looked at the ACB library, how the data looks like. So when I say directory, it's almost identical to how your ACB control blocks looks like in ACB library. If you open your directory in one window, and if you open a ACB live member in one window, and if you toggle between the two, they will look almost exactly identical because IMS process them, in the same way. So directory is just an extension of IMS catalog. So whatever the data which was stored in ACB live, they are first stored in catalog in the form of segment occurrences, and now the same information is stored in directory, and the format is almost equivalent to the format of the ACB live. The only thing is your directories are PDACs, they are not PDAs, and there are operational advantages of using PDACs that we all are aware of. So for IMS managed ACB, directory is one very important data set. So all those information which was previously present in ACB live will now be, part of directory data set. And when IMS starts up, if it is running in IMS managed ACB environment, it will look at the metadata from directory, not from the ACB live. And there are two directories. One is active directory and one is the staging directory. If you compare with the ACB live, we used to have three ACB live, right? One is your IMS ACB DD, which is non-suffixed ACB live, where you will stage your changes. And then there were two ACBs, IMS ACB A and IMS ACB B. And at any given point in time, either A or B might be active, right? But if you compare with managed ACB, there are two directory datasets. One is active directory. Obviously, there are multiple directory datasets, active directory datasets to accommodate the volume, but there is only one staging directory, basically where you stage your changes. So ACB lives are replaced by directory. And there is an additional dataset on the IMS managed ACB that's called Bootstrap dataset, which basically keeps track of your active and staging directory datasets. So as I mentioned, the directory has a functionality very much similar to like ACB live. From IMS perspective, it is just processing the information in the same way from directory as it was doing from the ACB live. And your directory records have a format which is almost identical to ACB live. And IMS is making sure that your directory is kept in sync with the catalog. And it is the responsibility of IMS. But since till the time you are not completely moved to DDL, you might still be using the gen processes, right? You might still be making DBD source changes, PSB source changes, doing ACB gen, and populating your catalog. So till that time, you need to make sure that you are keeping your ACB lives, your directory and catalog all in sync. Eventually, when DBD live, PSB live, ACB lives will go away, then you don't need to keep worry about ACB lives anymore. So that's an important thing which right now is not done by IMS, that still needs to be done by the user. And as I mentioned, IMS maintains a bootstrap dataset, which is just another dataset which keeps track of information about your active directories and staging directory. You can think of it, if you compare with the ACB live environment, as mod stat or a OLC stat dataset, which gives us the information about, okay, at any given point in time, what is the active ACB live. And in terms of the different data sets, as we have already talked about, they could be partitioned, and there could be different data set groups. And there are multiple directory data sets, especially for Active Directory. And for staging, there is only one. And then there is, in the last, there is bootstrap data sets to keep track of the directory data sets. So you have a catalog database, which is partitioned, and you have secondary index, which is also partitioned. You have multiple Active Directory datasets, single staging directory dataset, and BSTS. So these are all the datasets you have in managed DCB environment. And remember, we are doing this because the eventual goal is to run the DDL, right? Since we are saying that we want to make it similar to DB2, so what DB2 supports? It supports DML, which is data manipulation language, where you can run the select query, update query, delete query. So most of that is achieved by using IMS catalog. Then the second part is the management, which is called data manipulation, management, that is DDL, data definition language. So on the DB2 side, you used to run these queries like create table space, create table, alter table, create program. So those things is now possible to do on the IMS using DDL. But for DDL, you need to have an IMS catalog, which is a prerequisite for IMS Managed ACB, and you need to have IMS Managed ACB, which is a prerequisite of DDL. And the whole advantage of doing this IMS Managed ACB to be eventually be able to run DDLs, right? And maybe at some point in future, I am pretty sure IBM will be looking at supporting DCL, which is data control language, which is a third construct on the DB2 side of the house. That is basically to control which tables or table spaces have access to certain applications and views, things like that. So that's for more future. But for now, two things will be very similar to DB2. One is the DML, where you can manipulate the data, and one is the DDL, which can help you manipulate the data about the data. We call it as metadata. And as I mentioned in the beginning, IMS catalog is a IMS database. So you need to treat it like an IMS database, right? You need to think about taking an image copy from the recovery perspective. You need to do pointer checkers. You need to do reorg to reclaim free space. Anything and everything you will do for any critical IMS database for your application, you will do the same for IMS catalog database. And if your IMS catalog database is defined to the recons, you can use LDB OLR, which is non-destructive reorg. If it is not defined to the recons, a reorg utility must be used. And obviously, when we talk about IMS database, it's not possible to not think about image copies and recovery procedures, because in case of disaster recovery, obviously this is going to be an important asset which you need to recover, which contains all the information about all your critical database and application. This is just one view how IMS will look like or looks like in IMS managed DCB environment. So we have this IMS, right, which is sorry, which is connecting to different databases, and similarly you have something called as ACB Lib, which is getting populated from PSB Lib and DBD Lib. And from ACB Lib, you are using catalog populate utility to populate your catalog database. And similarly, from catalog populate, you are populating the same information to the staging directory. And once the new information is in the staging directory, you might implement the change there. As I mentioned, you might want to add the third dependent segment to the bank database, that's called accounts. So in that case, you will do all the gens, populate the data to catalog database and to the staging directory. Maybe you will run unload reload kind of utility, and then once the change is done, you will import or activate the changes. So what is changing in IMS managed ACB environment is, in the past we were using online change, but going forward we will be using import command, uh, which is a type 2 command, which is an equivalent of online change, to basically move your control blocks from staging directory to active directory and refresh in IMS storage. And similarly, from utilities perspective, if you are using any vendor utilities, BMC or any other vendor, they will either be looking at the DBD live or ACB live in the past. But now that metadata is moved to catalog and to directory. So obviously they need to get the same metadata from the directory datasets, and in some cases from the catalog. But one thing you might want to note here is, since this DBD live and ACB live, those are just the datasets, right? Which is associated with reserved DD names in IMS. And technically you can code any dataset there just for temporary testing purpose. But in case of managed ACB environment, these dataset names are now almost pretty much fixed from IMS standpoint. So you need to take little extra care in making sure what you're trying to do, and you're not overstepping on someone else's work. Because in the past you might be creating your own libraries, playing around with it and throwing away, which is not relevant. But now these datasets are common, so you need to be, little more extra careful in that. I will quickly move these slides. Okay, this is just the history of database and application change evaluation. So several, maybe couple of decades or 3 decades back, the only way to make any changes, let's say you want to add a database or change a database or add an application, the only way was to do the gens, populate it to ACB live, add that information to your sysgen macro, do the mod blocks, do the sysgen, and simply restart your IMS systems, right? That was the only option in the beginning. Later on, uh, IBM came up with something called as online change, where it supported this concept of make some changes, put it into the staging ACB lives, use online change, copy it to inactive library, and then simply switch it, make inactive active and active becomes inactive. So that gave a lot of flexibility. Obviously BMC has its equivalent called delta reload. So that was the second big evaluation. Third one is the import command. As I mentioned, if you are using DRD environment to make mod blocks changes, you can simply do the import command. If you're using vSAM repository or if you're using RTDS implementation of DRD. That was the third biggest change. And then the fourth one was obviously with the IMS catalog and managed ACBs. So you have your IMS catalog, you have your staging directory, you have your active directory, right? And once your changes are there in the staging directory, you have implemented it using, let's say, unload and reload, and you want to run the import, you can simply run the type 2 command, and it will populate the changes from staging to active and refresh in IMS storage. And last but not the least, which is our eventual goal, is to support DDL, and DDL with auto import, right? So today, as I mentioned in that example, if you are adding that third segment type to the customer segment account segment, in that case, you are doing DBD changes, ACB, DBD gen, ACB gen, populating it to catalog, populating it to staging directory, and then implementing the changes. But that thing will be replaced. Your DDLs will directly populate the data in staging, in IMS catalog and in staging directory. And then you can run the unload reload kind of utility to implement the change and then run the import. So that's the eventual goal, and that will make it similar to how people do on the DB2 side of the house. Okay, so in terms of what is requirement and what is not requirement at this point in time, so obviously, if you're talking about DDL, DDL is not a mandatory requirement as of today, but it might be at some future point in time. But obviously, for running DDL, you need to have IMS catalog, which is implemented as HALDB, PHIDEM, OSAM. You need to have IMS Managed ACB. That's all your directory datasets. That's a prerequisite for DDL. And for running import, your type 2 command uh, is a prerequisite because import is a type 2 command. And for that, you need SCI OM, basically CSL, right? And what is not a requirement? Um, so obviously, as I mentioned, DDL is not mandatory. It is optional as of now, but it might move to mandatory requirement in future. Your DBD gen, PSB gen, and ACB gen might go away. ODBM and IMS Connect is not required, especially after the introduction of ZDDL utility to run any kind of DDLs. So how your day will look like once you have converted your IMS systems from ACB Live, DBD Live implementation to IMS Managed ACB. That includes IMS catalog. Obviously, your maintenance procedures will be impacted because how you were making changes 5 years back may not be, you know, totally same when you move to IMS catalog and IMS managed ACB. And when you talk about maintenance procedure, that includes BMC utilities. If you are using BMC IMS utilities, for some time you will continue to use your gen processes, but at the same time you will start testing the DDL because at some future point in time that will be the only option to implement the changes. But for that we need to start today. So it is highly recommended that we start testing DDL, especially in our development systems and lower level systems. One of the great utility that IBM provided is ZDDL. That makes this, testing DDL simpler because you can simply schedule a BMP or DLI batch job and run some DDLs. And we know that IBM is still working on fixing some last remaining problems related to IMS managed ACB. From the catalog perspective, I would say most of the problems are now fixed and it's pretty stable. But from IMS managed ACB perspective, there are still few which require some attention. And vendors like us, BMC, we are also working on fixing some last remaining known problems. And hopefully all that thing will be fixed before the July of next year. Okay, so let's take an example. Until you transition to DDL, how your world will look like. So you have an IMS control region, you will do the ACB gen. Take the same example where you are trying to add the third segment, which is an account segments. You do the ACB gen, populate your ACB live. You will do the cat pop to populate your catalog and staging directory. And so that is one way. But another way could be you could do the same thing by running a DDL and commit it so that it will populate the information into the catalog and staging directory. So these are the two mechanisms, right? Either run the ACB path or run the DDL path. And eventually new information will be there in the catalog or staging directory. And eventually, once you are satisfied that everything is good, you will run the import command that will move the changes from the staging directory to active directory and it will refresh in IMS storage. Probably until you transition to DDL, you might continue to use the gen processes in the DB lives and PSB lives and ACB lives, or you might be running in a mixed mode where for some changes you will still be doing gens and for some changes you will be doing DDL. But during that transition period, means after the transition period is over, you will only be dependent on DDL. So that will only be the one way to implement a change. So this is how your life will look like once you transition to DDL. So this part, the left-hand side of the gens, the DBD lives, ACB lives, PSB lives, and populating the catalog will go away. and you will only be able to make changes using DDL, which will populate your catalog and staging directory, and you will import the changes using import command, or maybe using delta reload if you are using BMC Delta products. Now let's talk about how BMC utilities detect managed ACBs and what's our philosophy. So we mainly talk about two things here. If you are using batch utilities, we have one mechanism, and if you are using online utilities, we have one mechanism. When I say online utilities, especially if you are running under control region, or if you're running under dependent regions, let's say IFPs or BMPs or MPPs. So some of our application, especially on the fastpath side, they run as IFPs. And when IMS comes up, it reads this member, proclive member, DFSTF XX proclive member. And it builds a control block in IMS storage called DFS3ACH. And that control block has everything, whether you are IMS catalog, whether you are IMS managed ACB, how many catalogs are used, how many directory datasets are there. All that information is there, built in a control block. And if we are running in an online fashion, we are simply referring to that control block to get the most trusted information about the IMS catalog and directory datasets. But if we are running in batch utilities, we have some hoops that we take in order of priority. So we have some special DD names where you can hard code, directory dataset names and the catalog high level qualifier. You can also hard code to say that the utility should fall back to ACB live in case of emergency, although that is not recommended. But in case of emergency, or if you want to read from ACB live, we do have keywords to fall back. But we follow the same thing what IMS follows. So we have this exit called DFS3CDX0, which is an assembler exit, right? Which is basically an equivalent of whatever information you code on DFSTF XX proclive member. So if you are using this assembler exit, we call this assembler exit, and it will give us the information, what is the catalog, if catalog is active, if directory is active, and what is the catalog alias name. Similarly, we can get the same information from DFSTF XX proclive member. So it will give us three things. Whether catalog is yes, managed DCB is yes, and what is the catalog alias name, which is 4 bytes. And we use that catalog alias name, and then we find the directory high level qualifier from the MDA live member. And that should be there. And that way we determine, okay, this is the directory dataset that we need to read because we are in catalog and IMS managed DCB environment. Obviously, as I mentioned that IMS catalog is a IMS database, hell DB. So it's registered in recons 99% of the times. And we can extract the information optionally from the recon, but that's the last option we fall back to. So we look at some special DDs. If they are not there, not mentioned, we invoke the exit, we get the information. If the exit is not there, we read the proclive member, get the relevant information. If it's not there, then we read the recon, get the relevant information. So that is only to determine, okay, now we are not in ACB live environment. We are in managed ACB environment. We are in catalog environment. And if yes, what are those catalog dataset names and directory dataset names that we need to read the information from? And as I mentioned, once this decision is made in the step one, the next step is to change our source. So obviously in the past, we were reading that information from DBD live or ACB live, right? Using the BZAM read for PDS. But now we are reading the same information in managed ACB environment from directory. And we are using a special API that IBM provided, which is called DFS3CATQ, to read the information from PDAC. So once the determination is done, and once we identified what is the correct source now to read the information, and once we read the information in storage, it's in the same format. As I mentioned before, the information in ACB live and directories, it's in the same format. So once we get in storage, from that point onwards, It's basically business as usual, and you will simply get all the uh, you know uh, metadata, and it will be read the same way as IMS is reading, and all the utilities will automatically work from there. So the change and the impact is only in these two initial stages of the utilities processing. One is the determination of catalog and manage the CB environment and the dataset names identification. And second is to read that information, because previously we were reading from somewhere else, that is ACB Live, using native ZOS BZM read. But now we are reading from directory using IBM supplied API. So sometimes we do face problems with the API, and we have to closely work with IBM because API might not be giving us what we expect, what we were getting from ACB Live, and things like that. So those are the two main impacts, especially from the toleration perspective: determination, identification, and then actually reading the metadata. But once the data is read, from that point onwards, it's pretty much business as usual. Okay, Subhashish, how we are doing on time?
Anshul, we have around 10 minutes remaining.
Okay. So yeah, means I do not want to go into whole lot of details, because obviously in the following sessions we will be going into more technical details of how each of the full function products, backup and recovery products, fast path products, and TM products are, you know, doing all these things, and we'll showcase some jobs and demo. So that is where we'll be going into more technical detail. But yeah, today I wanted to cover it at a very high level: what the catalog is, what are the advantages, what is directory, why all this came into existence, and what is our general philosophy, and the impact from the toleration perspective. Obviously, in the session number 5, we will be talking about the exploration, where we do provide some features that can help you manage a catalog databases and directories more effectively. But yeah, in first few session we'll be focusing on more on the toleration, how basically we support IMS catalog and manage DCB. So as I mentioned, from the batch perspective, there are three options. Again, this will be discussed in more detail later on. But if you are using this assembler exit DFS3CDX, and it is nothing but a programmatical representation of what you have in that proclib member DFSTFXX proclib member. So whatever you code there, you can code in exit. The advantage of using exit is you can simply copy this exit in the step like concatenation, and you don't need to change your 200 or 500 JCLs. But if you are using proclib option, obviously you need to make some JCL changes, which could be very cumbersome for some customers. So this is what IBM and BMC recommend, to use these exits, and it's pretty simple. IBM provides some samples, and once this is coded, probably won't require much changes, and it can be included in step live, and things are sorted. No JCL changes required. But if you are not using this exit, obviously IMS is referring this proclib member DFSTFXXX, and our utilities can read the same proclib member and do the same determination what IMS has determined at the beginning of this startup. So that's the second option. And then eventually, once we have the catalog determination, direct managed ACB determination, in the catalog alias name, we need to determine the directory datasets. And that information might be present in MDLI member. And we get the high level qualifier because that's needed by that API. We need to pass the directory dataset name to that API. So we get this information from MDLI member and pass it to that IBM API. And eventually, if you are obviously if you are defining your catalog in DBRC, the information is present in the recon, and we can extract the information from recon. Right. So those are the four things. But if all those options gives you negative, then we fall back to DBD Live and ACB Live. So that's the general philosophy. And we do have a couple of keywords in the batch utilities, which can help you to fall back to ACB Live or DBD Live in case of an emergency. That's not recommended, but they are there just for emergency. Okay, this is the slide which I have talked about in the beginning. So you can basically scan this QR code and it will directly take you to that TB where we talk about our current IMS managed ACB support. And that way you can determine, okay, if you are using a particular BMC AMI data for IMS product, and if you are concerned about that, you can find out if it already supports catalog and managed ACB or not. There are very few subset of products which are in partially supported list. And if you are concerned about that, please reach out to us and we will let you know our plans and we'll address that. But I highly recommend you, if you are using BMCME data for IMS utilities, look at this TB and that will give you more details of how and what and when things will be supported, because we will be concerned about catalog and managed DCB because summer of 2025 is approaching fast now.